Hello and welcome. My name is Drew Redden, and I'm the President and CEO of the Oakville Chamber of Commerce. It's my pleasure to open today's event and introduce our guest, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, Erin O'Toole. Today, Mr. O'Toole will deliver brief opening remarks that will be followed by an in-depth conversation moderated by past Chair of our Chamber Board, Tim Cadigan. The questions for today's event have been developed in consultation with Oakville Chamber members and align with Chamber network priorities. For those of you who signed up on Zoom, you may also submit your questions throughout the discussion, and Tim will do his best to ensure the topics and themes are addressed throughout the conversation. I also want to thank those of you who are now tuning in across our various social platforms. And on that note, I'm pleased to introduce our guest today. Erin O'Toole grew up in a GM family in Bowmanville, Ontario. At the age of 18, Erin joined the Royal Canadian Air Force and completed his studies at the Royal Military College. He continued his officer training in Chilliwack, British Columbia, then Winnipeg, Manitoba, and settled in Halifax, Nova Scotia. As a tactical helicopter navigator, he participated in search and rescue missions off Canada's coast, rising to the rank of captain. After 12 years of service, Erin retired from the military and returned to school to complete his law degree at Dalhousie University. Erin spent the next decade working as a lawyer in the private sector, and loyal to his brothers and sisters in arms, Erin became one of the co-founders of the True Patriot Love Foundation, a national charity serving veterans and families. Elected 3 times in his riding of Durham, Erin recently served as the shadow cabinet minister responsible for foreign affairs and was instrumental in establishing the Special Committee on Canada-China relations. However, his proudest accomplishments remain marrying his wife, Rebecca, and being a dad to his 2 children, Molly and Jack. Elected leader of the official opposition in August 2020, he is committed to standing up for all Canadians and building a stronger, more united country. On behalf of the Oakville Chamber, it is my pleasure to welcome the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, Erin O'Toole. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Drew. It's great to be back with you at the Oakville Chamber today, but this time virtually from Ottawa. COVID means I have to stick with Zoom calls and meetings like this, which I'm sure your chamber has pivoted to in the last year. But I'm looking forward to speak with you for the 3rd time in my political career, and the 1st time as the opposition leader, on critical issues facing your members in Oakville and in Southern Ontario. Et si vous avez des questions en français, n'hésitez pas à me les poser après. Canada's in the middle of the biggest health and economic crisis we've faced in modern times. We need to get Canadians back to work in every sector and in every region of the country. Last month, the Conservative opposition secured the creation of a special House of Commons committee devoted to Canada-US economic relations. And ultimately, our initiative received the support of all parties. This will help advance one of the most important pillars of our economic recovery for Oakville, for my area, the Durham region, and indeed for all of Canada. And that is the economic relationship and trade between Canada and the United States. This committee, which has just started this week, will get answers for Canadians about the Liberal government's failure to address Buy American procurement rules. It will look into the economic impacts of the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline and the severe threat to the Enbridge Line 5 pipeline cancellation that our country is worried about right now. It will also tackle other important issues like tariffs, energy, security, and collaboration on the environment. We must begin now to plan for the reopening and rebuilding of our economy. But clearly, we can't do that without vaccines. All Canadians have been disappointed to see Canada at the bottom of many global vaccine deployment rankings. As leader of the opposition, I have a job to do to hold the Liberal government to account and push for better. And we have, when we suggested vaccine supply from India. And after our suggestion, Mr. Trudeau made the call and we're getting several million more. So we're helping. And let me be absolutely clear. I want the government to succeed on vaccines. In fact, Canadians need them to succeed because it's only with the millions of vaccines that can get deployed across this country that the health risk will go down. And then we can start turning the corner in the COVID crisis so that we can focus on the immense economic challenges ahead of our country. I wish the government hadn't let us down on this slow and cumbersome start to vaccines, but they did. I'm worried now that the same will happen with the economic recovery. We can't afford to be at the bottom of the G7 list on the economic recovery and job creation post-COVID. Entrepreneurs, small business owners, and their staff are struggling. Small businesses themselves racked up $135 billion in debt, and too many fear they'll never be able to pay it back. Studies have shown that 1 in 6 businesses are fearing insolvency in the next year across this entire country, putting as many as 2 million jobs at risk. That would be devastating for chambers of commerce like yours from coast to coast to coast. Small business is an engine that we need to make sure not just survives the crisis, but thrives afterwards. Canada needs a serious and ethical government focused relentlessly on job creation and a serious economic recovery. That's really what the next election, whenever it comes, will be about. Who can secure a strong economic future for Canada following COVID-19? Which path do Canadians want to take? The path of an economy reimagined by a small group in Ottawa that will in fact leave behind thousands of families and entrepreneurs and workers, or the other path, a certain path to secure a future in all sectors in all regions of the country. This is what the Conservative Party is advocating. The path that may be less glamorous, but it's steady and certain. And after a year of turmoil, I think Canadians will embrace steady and certain over the buzzwords and scandals of the Trudeau government. Canada needs a serious and ethical government once again because our prosperity is at stake and our decline began before COVID. As I said at the outset, I've had the pleasure of meeting with the Oakville Chamber of Commerce twice before. The first time in 2014 as the Parliamentary Secretary for Trade to talk to your members about the European trade deal. And then in 2017, I was with you in your boardroom when I ran for the leader of the Conservative Party the first time. I've talked to many people about the meeting I had in your offices in 2017. One of your members, an accountant, told me in the session that almost all of the client work he had done in the previous year was to help Ontario companies establish US subsidiaries or to transfer assets or operations to their existing US subsidiaries. This was a glimpse of the impact of the Trudeau Liberals' high tax, high regulation, and their anti-corporate language in action. We cannot afford to be grossly out of step with our US friends, partners, and competitors. We need to make sure that Southern Ontario in particular remains competitive and integrated with the Great Lakes manufacturing basin. We need to secure this access and this certainty after COVID. As the father of 2 young kids, my greatest worry is that we will fail after COVID to leave a better Canada to them. I don't want them saddled with $500 billion of debt from the last few years of Mr. Trudeau. So this is what really drives me, making sure we offer to our children and grandchildren a prosperous, united, and free country. I love Canada, and I know our greatest days are ahead. We will get through this crisis, but it takes leadership. And that's why every day I'm telling Canadians about the vision the Conservative Party have for a stronger economy, a more prosperous country, and a more united Canada. I hope you'll join me to rebuild our economy and secure this future for Oakville, for the GTA, and for all of Canada. So thanks for having me back the third time, this time virtually, and I look forward to the discussion.
Good morning, Mr. O'Toole. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Tim.
Good to see you again.
Great to be back.
You introduced a lot of topics, and some of them align with some of the questions from our members, so I want to dive right into that. The first around small businesses, and particularly, I think in our discussion today, I want to get a sense of what you and your party would do for some of the topics that we'll cover. So, for instance, with small business, can you talk about what an O'Toole-led party would do post-pandemic on economic recovery, and particularly as it deals with small businesses?
Certainly. Thanks, Tim. First, we have already done a few things. And one, it's important for me to point out, we have actually worked with the government throughout this pandemic. We always want to put the well-being of Canadians first, particularly in a crisis. So we have supported a lot of their programs and supported getting them out the door quickly. Where we had concerns, we would approve the program and then work to fix it and make it better afterwards. So our efforts very quickly led to the wage subsidy being increased from 10 to 75%. That took a few weeks. It took several months for us to get changes to the rent program for a lot of small, particularly retail businesses that were suffering. So we've worked with the government. In the last few months, we've also asked for the CRA to stop the punitive audits on these programs in the middle of the crisis. I'm sure many of your members have already experienced this, where a small business with not much accountancy and compliance teams, often it's a family and a number of employees, have CRA descend and have punitive audits at a time that the company is holding on for dear life. So we asked for a suspension of such audits. The Liberals opposed this. We've also asked for sector-specific support for highly affected sectors. They're only now rolling out some of that programming. We've asked for support in terms of loan extensions and other things to airlines and some other critically impacted sectors. They're slowly moving towards that. So we're preparing for the campaign whenever it comes, a Save Small Business package that will have a number of these measures and will almost rebalance the way we look at bankruptcy, insolvency, and restructuring of businesses. I worked on this in the private sector. We need those SMEs across the country to survive so that they can thrive when the economy rebounds. And as I said in my remarks, Tim, 2/3 of Canadians either work for or are part of the ownership structure of a small or medium-sized enterprise. We cannot afford for those families and the employees to have many of them slide into insolvency and liquidation. So we're going to have a very substantive package. And in fact, this week when the House of Commons returns, we'll be raising a few suggestions on this over the course of the week. So it's a top priority for us.
One of the other things that comes up at many of our roundtables, and it may in fact have come up at the one that you were here back in 2017, small business owners talk a lot about the tax code and how complex it is. You mentioned the fact that they don't have accounting departments, for instance, to help them navigate the tax code. We have been calling for a comprehensive review of the tax code for several years. That may not happen for some time. What other options are there to try to foster our competitiveness for businesses outside of a comprehensive tax code review?
Great point. In fact, in my leadership, I said we need a simplification of the tax code for the SME. As I was an in-house counsel, so I was a compliance, I was a lawyer, but for Procter & Gamble, not exactly a small business. There are so many small businesses that if you burden on a lot of compliance, as I said, the regulatory complexity under the Liberals, the more taxes are huge burdens to a small business. And that has been punishing and they can't keep up. So we need to simplify. The small business tax changes that the Liberals brought in a few years ago, they stepped back on a few after tremendous outcry from business groups, from us, from chambers across the country, was a sign that the government views things like retained earnings and other things as more tax dollars for Ottawa. They don't understand the corporate structure and how families, professionals, a whole range of people depend on it for uncertainty in the future. In fact, retained earnings in the last year probably has saved a number of businesses. They don't get that. Mr. Trudeau just looks for new opportunities to tax. So we're still committed to a simplification, Tim. Our challenge now is we are going to be facing a $400 billion deficit, and we want to still help people transition as we rebuild from COVID. But if we don't get people working so that people can come off the support programs and we can get our fiscal house in order over the course of a decade in a way that's fair and helps people and helps acutely impacted sectors, if we don't get this under control, the Liberal government is putting healthcare at risk. They're putting old age security at risk because the government cannot afford such gargantuan deficits. And if interest rates, which people are already worried about, come up, the Liberal government is setting us up for a debt crisis. So it's serious. That's why we need leadership, not photo ops. We need a prime minister that reads the contracts, that gets us vaccines quickly, that holds a timeline and accountability, as I've done as a minister and in the private sector and the military. It's time for serious leadership.
It's interesting because the opinions on debt and deficit vary depending on who you're listening to. So certainly there's concern. I was listening to one of the top economists at one of the big banks saying that there's lots of runway left for Canada's capacity. And in fact, I think compared to most of our competitors, we're still pretty low on debt and deficit. So where do you go with that? How concerned, is that a top priority for you? And how fast, I think you said a decade, how fast do you address it? Because obviously addressing that too aggressively is going to have a negative impact on the economy as well.
Good question, but let's review where we are, Tim. Out of our G7 competitors, Canada spent the most per capita, and we have the worst outcomes. I'm not happy about that, but we have the highest unemployment in the G7. Business confidence is at, disturbing lows. And so the only growth we saw in the economy in the last quarter was the hot housing market, Oakville probably being one of the epicenters of that, and resource economy. Now, Mr. Trudeau doesn't like the resource economy. Bill C-69, it's time to transition. He talks about there's no softwood lumber deal. It kind of shows that if we don't support jobs in all sectors in all parts of the country, we're not going to have a strong economic recovery. So we have to stop the, quite frankly, misguided and ideological approach of the Liberal government. I'm not sure if the accountant I referred to a few years ago is on the call. Maybe they can wave their hand and Becky can find them in the room today. There were already huge risks to our economy pre-COVID. $160 billion in capital investment left Canada under 5 years of Mr. Trudeau. He raised taxes across the board, including on small businesses, as we talked earlier, introduced a carbon tax when there wasn't one in the United States and in competitive state markets that the Oakville Ford plant competes with for vehicles. And the country was becoming divided under this ideological approach. That was all pre-COVID. In fact, a year ago this time, there was illegal rail blockades cascading across the country, and Warren Buffett pulled his $1 billion investment out of Canada because it didn't seem there was any certainty to getting things done in this country. We need to change that. We need to have a private sector that is investing, creating jobs, that is confident of doing business in Canada again. And we need to make sure people are working so that we can, over time, as I said, I've used a decade because I think in the first few years, as we rebuild from COVID, we will need to help some highly impacted sectors, including small business. But as we get people working and we're able to get the financial house in order, then we can tackle some of the economic challenges so that if there are interest rate rises in the future, they won't be cataclysmic for our economy. We cannot afford a few more years of the approach of Mr. Trudeau. It's simply, almost every business person I speak with agrees here. So I'm hoping people see that the Conservative Party is growing. We're a big blue tent. We've got great experience. I've got experience in the private sector, which the Liberals and their helpers out there are now attacking me for having worked in the private sector. I think we need a prime minister that actually has some experience. So that's what I'm offering, and opportunities like this to connect is how we're going to win.
So let me play devil's advocate for a moment, if you will. You talked about the unemployment, high levels of unemployment during the pandemic and the effect on the economy, and those are valid points. But on the other side, our deaths per 100,000, if you look compared to the G7, is low. In fact, I think it's the lowest. So, we certainly have had an impact on the economy. And when I talk to some small business owners, frankly, it hits me right in the heart listening to some of the stories they have to say. But if you think about what's happened in other markets where the death toll has been absolutely cataclysmic, how do you balance that?
This is why we support the health measures, Tim. And look, if you want to look back and compare how the handling of this was, when COVID first started, at the end of February, beginning of March, I said the country needed to adopt a warlike footing against COVID. I advocated using the military in our health system and long-term care system. I said we had to get our EI system ready for people that would have to stop work. The Liberal government mocked me for all of these suggestions. And at that time, they were still saying that there was no significant risk of human-to-human transmission. They've been 2 steps behind in every point in this crisis. It's been frustrating. I've even offered to work with them, suspended my leadership race. The military person in me always wants to put the country and the well-being of its people first. And I will continue to do that. That's why we've supported some of their spending. But I do think a slow response at the start, a terribly slow and ineffective approach to rapid testing. In fact, the federal government hurt the impact for Canada to really roll out rapid screening and rapid testing in a way that was serious. And now in the vaccines, no one likes to see us behind almost all developed countries with respect to the vaccine rollout. I am very proud of our first responders and our healthcare system, where I think that really helped us when we did do the measures that the provinces imposed. And this is where our public health system has helped us tackle it. We could have been a little faster, but that's where you see Canadians took the public health measures a lot more seriously than our friends in the United States. So while the vaccines are doing better in the United States now, we took the confinement more seriously and the isolation and these sort of measures. So I'm really proud of our front lines. I'm sure in Oakville, you probably had the parades like they did in Bowmanville of the cars honking around the hospitals and stuff. We owe them a lot. And that's why we also owe them learning the lessons from earlier stages in the pandemic. And it seems like the Trudeau government never learns. And to anyone in business, continuous improvement is the raison d'etre. And we need a bit of a serious get into the details government again. And that's that I will be as Prime Minister.
I have about an hour's worth of material and 20 minutes to fit it in. So we've got a lot of topics to try to cover. I want to talk to you. One of the critical elements that the pandemic has seen, I think, is access to broadband. There's various programs, both at the provincial and federal level. So I wanted to ask you what role the federal government would have in ensuring that Canadians have access to broadband.
Great question, Tim. And what's interesting is in the Durham region, I hear a lot of complaints about broadband. You would even in parts of Oakville in the wider area. But listen, I was on calls with 3 chambers of commerce in Nunavut yesterday. If you want to talk about the digital divide, it's not in the GTA. It is in vast parts of the rural parts of this country. And we're going to tackle it. In fact, we're in the process of developing some policy right now. And in every conversation I've had with the large providers, as I've been talking about COVID and workforce, and I've said 2 things. This has to be a priority because the digital divide has been more pronounced in the pandemic as education and so many other things have been taking place online. So that's one thing. And the more we can engage, particularly in rural connectivity, Aboriginal, Indigenous-led businesses to also help light up some of those communities, I think there's a huge economic reconciliation play that can be part of this. And the federal government will come in because there are obviously going to be a lot of areas where there will not be a business case for towers or fiber. That gap, that bridge has to be from public participation. And we are looking right now at that. The federal government now has about 8 different funds for the broadband gap. It is cumbersome, it is slow, it is not business focused. I will be accelerating this and putting an all hands on deck approach to it, because we have to battle ready broadband for small businesses, for everyone, now that we've learned how we're so dependent on it. So this is something we're prepared to invest in, and we'll demand better accountability than the clumsy and slow approach we've seen.
It's a vast country. A lot, as you said, a lot of areas are completely disconnected. Premier Legault is saying that the rollout in his province will happen before the next election. So I believe that's 2022. So that's pretty aggressive. Just looking ahead in your crystal ball, what sort of timeline do you think you can put on broadband at a national level?
It will be as quick as possible. You know, I have a very good relationship with Premier Legault because he like me, wants to have measurement, data, and performance as part of government. We've got tremendous men and women that work in our civil service, and I served as a minister. I saw that firsthand. But direction and some innovation is needed. And in this area in particular, we should not fear working with small, medium, and even large providers. If we're not leveraging as much private sector capital, as much nonprofit or community, some communities have brought high-speed connectivity, much like Oakville and Bowmanville and all these places owned their hydro connectivity to the home, and now these LDCs are kind of regional. This is the new utility that's going to the home. So we've got to bring innovation and partnership. And what I don't like about the Trudeau government is this anti-business sentiment they have. That's part of the reason why we don't have vaccines, is they were having almost a war with the pharmaceutical industry in the last few years. They've called small businesses tax cheats, and you're changing this. And even the ads they're running against me now. You know, I'm a kid from the suburbs of the GTA. I was never a partner at a law firm. I was working hard to work at great law firms and worked with great clients, startups, big companies. They're attacking me for having some business experience. And I think we have to have a private sector led recovery in a lot of sectors here. And so on the broadband piece, by partnering, by having a multiplier effect through private capital investment, through municipal and some other nonprofits, the government should be an accelerator here. So I will hold to account. When I was veterans minister, Tim, I inherited a department that had class action lawsuits, that had wait times, that was losing trust of the people it served, the veterans. I brought in a team, veterans, private sector people, established a plan, and turned a lot of it around in 10 months because there's leadership needed. Politics is not about the photo op, it's about the follow up. And we don't have that now with the Prime Minister. So I don't want to give you a time, November 10th, 2023, there will be lit up a gig internet across the country. But I will be a hands-on accountability leader, and that's what we need coming out of a crisis.
Okay, I want to swap now into Canada-US relations. A lot of businesses here in Oakville, as you know, do business in the States. They either have offices there, or a lot of products go back and forth across the border, much like the Ford Motor Company, for instance. Talk to me a little bit about President Biden's Buy America stance and what we can be doing to try to perhaps get an exemption to that, or to find a way that Canadian businesses can survive what could potentially be a shutdown of much of our potential business opportunities in the States.
Great question, Tim. And that's why I raised it in my remarks. Certainly my times in Oakville with your chamber. And then I did one session that we had at Ford. I've been through Oakville a lot as a GTA MP. You know what? I'd be the first prime minister to represent a GTA riding in history, which is an interesting fact, as my son would say. Interesting fact, Dad. But this is critical for Southern Ontario, access to the US market. Since the mid-1960s, communities like Oakville and Ford, I am a GM guy. I have to admit, it's like me admitting to be a Leafs fan when I'm talking to Montreal business people. I'm a GM guy. The Oshawa folks, the Auto Pact allowed vehicles to roll off those lines and be treated as domestic for sale in the United States. That was the first free trade in North America. And so this is what was crazy. When the Trudeau government renegotiated NAFTA, you know what was missing in their list of priorities? Auto. We have to make sure the US realizes that the aluminum produced in Saguenay and the military base there, the military base was partially built by the Americans to safeguard the aluminum supply for World War II. We have been integrated and partners on both trade and security for several generations, and we're losing that now. And I think we can win it back. It's why I raised this with the Prime Minister in November, to get in front of the Biden administration on both this and energy security pipelines. It's why we created a parliamentary committee focused laser-like on the US-Canada economic relationship. And just this week, it started its first meetings. That was our initiative. This is critical to the well-being of Southern Ontario. And it's also why I don't like the Trudeau carbon tax. We are uncompetitive vis-a-vis our competitive border states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, where there's no input price on carbon. I've always said any of these things we do have to fall in line with the United States, or we're going to hear a giant sucking sound of investment and jobs to the US. The government's own reports call it leakage. We have to be competitive on a tax and regulatory basis. And the Buy American piece is something I think a smart approach to diplomacy can solve. And here's where I'm uniquely suited. In uniform, I served alongside the United States when some of our ships at sea with NATO, we trained with the Americans in Puerto Rico and off the eastern seaboard. When I go to the United States, I meet with some of the veterans that are in Congress. There's a real connection. Security and trade are like this in the United States. And I also worked for one of the largest, most respected US companies, Procter & Gamble, as their counsel in Canada. I worked on Canada-US trade issues and other things. I like to joke, Tim, for a year, I was the global lawyer for one of their billion-dollar brands, CoverGirl Cosmetics. Now, I know when you see me, that doesn't jump out at you, but it's time for Canada to have a prime minister that understands business, that understands critical foreign relations like the United States, and help remind legislators in the United States that Canada is their only domestic homeland security and trade partner.
Isn't it fair to say, though, I'm sure you watched the bilat with President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau, that perhaps our governments are more aligned now than they have been for quite some time? Isn't that a possibility, that when you talk about emissions and you talk about we're kind of in step now?
No, on the first day of the Biden administration, they canceled the Keystone XL pipeline without even a phone call. I don't call that aligned at all. In fact, there's been 2 Democratic administrations cancel that same pipeline under Mr. Trudeau's watch. In fact, we suffered heavily under the Obama administration because we didn't take the relationship seriously. I'll use an example. We gave up entry and exit data for people traveling on the border back when you can do that to the United States. We gave permission for ICE US agents to search people on Canadian soil, was pretty unprecedented. And in return, we got nothing. Keystone XL was canceled. Certainly under the Trump administration, things got totally out of hand with tariffs and a whole range of other things. But we missed the opportunity to focus on the NORAD relationship and other things to remind American members of Congress and members of the administration, the executive, of the unique position of Canada. It was a Canadian on duty in NORAD on 9/11. This is the type of relationship we have to speak. Mr. Trudeau is now out of step with 3 US administrations, including the Biden administration, on Huawei in the 5G infrastructure, on steel and aluminum transshipment, on the genocide against the Uyghur minority Muslim population in China. Mr. Trudeau is out of step with our closest allies. And I will tell you, Canada's voice is needed on the world stage more than ever. And it's not for dancing and photo ops. It's for being a strong and resolute partner for values we believe in, like human rights, including the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, and for security, whether it's Huawei or espionage, foreign influence operations. Our allies are desperate to have a serious Canada back.
I'm glad you mentioned Huawei. I do want to talk to you a little bit about our relationship with China, which is obviously pretty fractured right now. I would remind everyone watching that government still holds 2 Canadians hostages. Is it fair to say, though, that it puts our government in a difficult position? Because obviously what we want more than anything out of China right now is the release of two innocent Canadians that are being held hostage. Can they make bold statements against China? Because obviously that country gets offended very easily at just about anything that's said. They've been offended with you. They've been offended with Mr. Trudeau. They've been offended by even premiers. So what would a government do to try to get the release of those people while also making statements about Huawei, which I think they need to do?
Well, this is why, from the beginning, I describe this as diplomatic hostage taking. The Prime Minister is now using that language as well. His approach of kowtowing or currying favor with the communist regime in Beijing has clearly not worked. The Michaels have been there over 800 days. We have to take a principled position. And if the ambassador or other members of the Communist Party in Beijing are upset with me, it's because of my commitment to human rights and dignity. And I think Canadians should be okay to be on the right side of important issues, much like Mr. Mulroney was with apartheid a generation ago. I think there's now, since our motion in the House, Tim, last report I got from my team is about 4 or 5 other countries are having similar debates in their parliaments or legislatures. I think Canada should push for better. And I will tell you this, the regime in Beijing respects strength and does not like it when the international community combine in the condemnation of action. So what we should do is actually work with our allies to push for more pressure on a range of things, including Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor. I'm happy the Biden administration is being more vocal. I think that's a positive step. Australia is looking at becoming more vocal and having a Magnitsky sanction tool, which Canada has, a conservative-led initiative. That's a tool we should consider using as well. And only when bad action is called out in unison will we see progress. Because what happens is we're a smaller economy, and Beijing likes to leverage that and leverage the economic pressure and other pressures against smaller economies. But if the Five Eyes and other countries worked in unison on principle, I think there's a better chance of positive movement with respect to Beijing. So we all sides of the political spectrum want to see the return of the Michaels. And I think at the same time, we also want to make sure that this type of conduct is not reinforced by us being silent. We actually take a stronger view so that there's more positive commitment to rule of law and respect for human rights in China.
I think I have time for one more question, and I want to stay on China. It would seem to me that our economy is so intertwined with China, as it is in the States. I went into my local Fortino's to buy frozen vegetables. I couldn't believe it. They were made in China. I did a reno back in the fall. I couldn't buy a toilet made anywhere but in China. Greeting cards at Christmas now, I notice, printed in China. It impacts virtually every business probably in our chamber in some way or another. How do we get out of that situation? You mentioned the size of this country and this economy. We're so enmeshed with them. What's our way out? That economy is growing at a pace that the rest of the world will be pretty well stuck with them unless there's alternatives.
Great question, Tim. I'm happy to tell you, if you're looking for great vegetables, I'll bring you some from the Durham region or from Leamington. All of the things you mentioned, we can produce here, or we can source from countries that respect the rule of law, respect trade-based norms and human rights. And I think there will be a rebalancing of global trade in the coming years. It's already started. I've been talking about this for a few years now. And I think Canada needs to lead the effort so that we can make sure we're positioned to benefit from it. We have to work with the US with respect to Chinese trade conduct, particularly on steel and aluminum. We should have started working back when the Obama administration began to tariff such action, because we've suffered. The auto industry in Ontario, more products being made with aluminum. in Mexico with Chinese aluminum. And by the way, Chinese aluminum, 8 times more carbon intensive than from the Saguenay region of Quebec or Kitimat, BC. So I think this rebalancing will happen. And my sincere hope, and I've talked about this, the global world a generation ago provided the opportunity for China to enter the WTO with the sincere hope that it would lead to not just millions of people out of poverty, which it has, but to human rights, rule of law, and respect for the international based system. That has not worked. And in the last few years, Beijing has actually gone off in a very concerning direction. So we should start addressing that. And I think you'll see reshoring of some opportunity. I've been talking about that as well. I think you'll see tariffs, whether based on carbon emission or based on conduct. We should not buy things from Xinjiang, where there's forced labor of the Uyghur and Turkic Muslim peoples. Most Canadians agree with this, and most of our democratic allies do as well. So I think there's an opportunity to see more free and fair trade amongst free countries and establishing a norm approach that is aspirational, not a race to the bottom. You may pay a little more for that greeting card, Tim, but I think you'll know that it's not being made by Uyghurs in an internment camp. So I think consumer choice will drive this. It's already starting to, but we should work with our allies to rebalance trade norms.
Just to be clear, I put the greeting card back and I didn't buy the frozen nor would I. So believe me, when it comes to that, I drive people crazy at how principled I am.
My favorite greeting cards are ones my kids make with their own markers and construction paper. And I know the pulp and fiber in that construction paper is from the most ethical forestry industry in the world, which is Canadian.
I don't know that I could do that with markers and surprise my wife, but I'll take that under. I want to thank you for your time today. I know that you have a very busy schedule, so I really appreciate you joining us here at the Oakville Chamber. We very much appreciate, again, your conversation with us today. And to all our members, thank you for taking the time to log on and providing your questions to help facilitate this discussion. Please stay involved with the Chamber. You can follow along with our activities on our various social platforms or by visiting oakvillechamber.com. Mr. O'Toole, thank you once again.
Thank you, Tim, Drew, Becky. It's great being here the 3rd time. Let's hope we round the corner. My 4th time will be in person, perhaps as Prime Minister, but until then, best of health and prosperity to you and all your members.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
again, and have a safe and productive day.